Now imagine this, a game just dropped that you've been dying to play. So you hop on Discord, put out the bat signal, and hope there are some gamers ready to play. 6 of your friends show up, battle axe in hand, ready to go on a new adventure. You launch the game just to find out it's a maximum of 4 players. Now what do? Split up into 2 groups or have 2 people sitting there awkwardly, waiting for their turn to play? This story happens time and time again with some of the greatest games like Sea of Thieves, Phasmophobia, and most recently, Lethal Company. As an indie game developer, I'm on a mission to figure out why developers are limiting themselves to 4 players, and if there's anything we can do about that. Lucky for us, Cass Marshall already interviewed developers from Grounded, Sea of Thieves, and Minecraft Dungeons to explain why 4 is the magic multiplayer number. But before we get started, I'm going to say this. There are 2 reasons why I think you can develop a 4-player game. 1, if it's story-driven and it takes away from the player experience having more players. And 2, if it was originally designed as a couch co-op game, split that screen into 4 and be done with it. Let me know in the comments below why you think games are being developed for 4 players, and if you're running into the same issues as me. Alright, let's get into it. 1 may be the loneliest number, but 4 can sometimes feel just as limiting. See, right off the bat, this is where I disagree. 1 is a great number to build a story-driven game. In fact, that's the type of game I'm building right now, is a story-driven game about a corporate employee in hell. Make sure to wishlist now. But 4 can sometimes feel just as limiting, and I agree. That's the whole reason why we're getting into this article. Let's find out. There's just something about the magic number of 4 players that have become a standard for multiplayer games. And there are tons of great games and up-and-coming titles. Sea of Thieves, Back 4 Blood, Vermintide 2, Redfall, No Man's Skies, Borderlands series, Deep Rock Galactic, most of Grand Theft Auto Online, Grounded, Dino Crisis, Phasmophobia, that make you pick 3 other friends and buckle up. This article is a little bit old from a few of these games, but look at this. Sea of Thieves, easily 5 to 6 without destroying it. Back 4 Blood, okay, there's level design in here. A little harder to make it, but you could have a couple levels that could include some people. Same with Vermintide 2. Borderlands is kind of hard. I agree this should be a 4-player game. Deep Rock Galactic, you could probably add 1 more player pretty easily. Phasmophobia, easily, even though it's super scary game. Larger groups have to find workarounds or another game altogether. And yes, okay, so for Lethal Company, as we were just talking about, Lethal Company does have a mod to make it 16 to 40 players, and the game still works and has fun. Like, you wouldn't really want to play 40 in that game, but easily 6 players is why we did this. This can get awkward, and I've had several evenings where 3 friends and I are in Discord having a great time, and then a 5th friend joins the channel and asks, "What's up?" We all fall into shameful silence for a moment because we're having a great time, and the newcomer gets to either hang out and listen in or leave shunned and alone. This is literally real life, and happens quite frequently. Like almost every Friday this happens. If you're not the first person there, at some point throughout the night, you're gonna be shunned because the game we're playing is limited to 4. I've started to wonder, why don't developers simply add more players? If some games can do it, why not all of them? It's a seemingly simple question with a surprisingly complex answers. Luckily, the developers behind some very big multiplayer titles are able to share their thoughts. All right, convince me here. Mike Chapman, creative director at Rare. So that's Sea of Thieves right here. So what factors led you to landing on designing your game around 4 players? For Sea of Thieves, while the shared world nature of the game is a key aspect of the design, the core gameplay was designed around making players truly feel like they were working together as a crew, sailing their ships, gathering treasure, and surviving the perilous sea. And I will say, Sea of Thieves did a really good job of achieving that aspect of game design. However, by adding 2 extra players, bailing water will just be a little bit faster, the battles will be a little more intense, and the loot will be that much better. We designed the game around the desire to make our interactions between our players deep and meaningful, so many of our design decisions focused around putting the choice in the hands of players rather than dictating exactly how they play. And they don't dictate how you play at all in this. However, even with a couple extra players, as I mentioned earlier, you would still have that full choice. The battles would just be more intense, the loot would be better, and I think overall it would give the higher potential of having more fun with more players. With this in mind, we thought about the choice of 4 players in terms of how this applies in real life. If you imagine any kind of social gathering, 4 people is a really good number in terms of ease of conversation and interactions. While more people can of course be a positive, it inevitably means that more people are likely to split into subgroups and have side conversations and interactions, before then returning to the main group and again splitting into different subgroups. Now, I disagree with this. In most social interactions that I've been, that is not a sit-down situation. The goal of a social interaction is to form a circle. And with 4 people, you can only form a square. Therefore, circle better, 6 people equals circle. When you apply that back to the design of Sea of Thieves, while more players is positive, it relies on either an exceptionally strong social bond or additional game systems that add to the complexity of the game design to keep everyone working together. So I don't think actual game systems would need to be built for Sea of Thieves specifically. Right? Like, sure, you'd have to do some sort of balancing act between, the 2 players versus 6 players, especially when you get into a battle situation. But it can be something as simple as your total time to bail water is just divided among the people. So if you have, or just add it up. So you have 6 people, 6 seconds to bail water. If you have 2 people, it's 3 seconds to bail water. Or 2 seconds to fill up your water bucket. Something like that, right? And it doesn't even have to be like linear on that scale, but it's a very easy system to tweak like that. We want interactions between players in the crew to feel as natural as possible. We often joked about going on an adventure of Sea of Thieves should feel like going on a trip to the pub with your mates, not going to your school reunion. And again, yeah, I totally get that. The majority of tables in a restaurant situation are 4, but there are a ton of 6-player tables or circle tables where you can have those same interactions as a pub with those people. So the whole social ease of conversation, yes, with less people, obviously it is easier to talk, but it doesn't mean those conversations are always going to be better. It doesn't mean those conversations are going to be as natural, right? Sometimes you have to then force conversations with fewer people. So yeah, I think there's still an opportunity here, but I definitely understand what they're saying. When did the decision take place during development, and what was the conversation like? This was a decision made very early in development during our prototype phase. Given that the game's vision focused on crews of players working together in a shared world, one of the first major areas defined was the design of Sea of Thieves Galleon, and how the interactive elements of the ship were designed from the ground up for 4 players. The capstan, the sail pulleys, and the core handling and maintenance of the ship, including the fill rate of the water in the hull, and the additional speed through the water that each correctly aligned sails provided. And lastly, how treasure always remained physical in the world. Okay, so these designs are all things we've talked about, right? There's the different ships that have different speed, different amount of cannons on them. And again, the systems wouldn't have to be made. For example, the fill rate. We talk like you just add a longer fill rate if more players. So instead of designing from a ship aspect, you design on a ship to player ratio aspect. And I think that's all you need to do to easily balance the game. Again, easier said than done, but I think that's not a game stopper for why we stopped at 4 players. All of these decisions and how this led to these mechanics being balanced are a result of decisions to design the Galleon for 4 players based on what felt like the right size for a social group that may not always be the closest of friends in real life or know each other very well. Yeah, so again, they designed for the ship, the Galleon, not for like a combination of Galleon and player base, which I guess is what was the limiting factor on this one. Why do you think 4 players is a common design choice among cooperative games? Okay, this is exactly why we're here. It really comes down to the difference between what it feels like to truly work with other players as compared to just working alongside others or playing parallel with them trying to accomplish more singular goals. Okay, first off, Sea of Thieves, there is only one goal: to become the greatest pirate on the open sea and collect as much treasure as possible. While a larger player count in team-based games, typically well into the double figures, is really the norm for cooperative experience, this isn't really the norm for cooperative experiences. I think they're maybe talking about like MMO style games. It's really the optimal number to keep that close, intimate conversation flowing between players. There's certainly an element of earlier multiplayer experience focusing on 4 players due to how many times you can split the screen on a single TV. But with Sea of Thieves, we found that 4-player also provided a close-knit, intimate type player interaction that helped immerse players in our world and get them working together. Okay, so we did mention that there was a split screen stuff for couch co-op games. They admitted this wasn't that. but they went that 4 players was the most intimate version of this. And right from the beginning, I think like the larger ships can easily be designed or improved for 5 or 6. Actually, it's not even the ships. It's the game systems behind it, and the balancing can be balanced for 5 or 6 players without taking the players from the immersive world, and then just overall making it better, because there's going to be more chaos. There's going to be more fun if you choose to go that route. Mans Olsen, game director, Minecraft Dungeons. Okay, well, I don't know much about Minecraft Dungeons other than it's kind of like an ARPG dungeon crawler game, as the title involves. And I can understand with that why those are kind of 4-player games. But what I'm curious is, why not 5? So what factors led you to land on designing your game around 4 players? A key factor is that the number of players varies across game sessions. Minecraft Dungeons supports up to 4 players playing together, either online or in couch co-op. Okay, so right away they did design for couch co-op, so 4 players answers that question, why not 5? Just makes it more accessible. On many different platforms. There's a lot of nuisance and balancing that goes into supporting both players by yourself and with up to 3 others. We want to make sure the experience is fun and relatively similar regardless of how you play. For example, mission geometry has to be laid out in such that players have space to maneuver while still using choke points to their advantage. Enemies should come in such numbers that they are a threat while not being completely overwhelming. Since you play on the same missions regardless of player count, with players able to hot join or leave at any time, keeping the span relatively small, 1 to 4, rather than say 1 to 12, makes many design and gameplay considerations a little bit easier. And so if you were, I guess I would accept this answer if it wasn't a $1 billion company. You know, if you're a $1 billion company, I guess it's just you're focused on the bottom line and not the optimal experience for the most amount of people. Just get the majority of people and call it good. Because they probably could have easily done 5 or 6 players, but because that's not couch co-op, the ROI on that's just way lower. Our supported platforms are also the main reason why we made this choice. Game consoles have traditionally supported up to 4 players, and although many now support more than that, it's becoming an established norm that's useful for both players and developers. As developers, we know many players have 1 to 4 controllers available to them for playing together, but very few households have more than 1 connected to any console. Yeah, again, this is the right reason to build a game for 4 players, and I bet you they did their research here that shows that many households only have 1 console. So I can get on board why this game specifically was made for a maximum of 1 to 4 players. Games staying at or at least near that target is good for players, as they're able to reuse their hardware for different games, and good for developers because they can target a common denominator. This doesn't matter as much for online games, but a big factor for games that support couch co-op. Yeah, Minecraft, you've sold me. We don't really have to go through too much more on this. Like, I'm on board with you. When did this decision take place during development, and what was the conversation like? Minecraft Dungeons was originally conceived as a single-player game. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. A few months into development, as we started testing prototypes internally, we all really wanted to play the game in multiplayer. We sat down as a team, talked about how to best do that, and we ended up with an approach that is partly inspired by the classic dungeon crawlers, but also greatly inspired by notable 4-player cooperative titles such as Left 4 Dead and Warhammer End Times, Vermintide. There's something very appealing about the degree of cooperation that those games offer, where players really have to work together to achieve the best result. At the same time, we wanted to keep supporting the single-player core that we've already begun building. Throughout development, we've erred on the side of fun in multiplayer, but we've tried to support a variety of player experience as far as possible to make the game approachable and accessible for a wide group of players. Yeah, no, this makes sense, right? They started to build it on for 1 player. They wanted to play with more players, so they did the best they could. Honestly, I'm going to try Minecraft Dungeons after this because it seems like the right reason to build a game for 4 players. Why do you think 4 players is a common design choice among cooperative games? I think a combination of factors work together to make 4 a great choice. The traditional controller cap for consoles is an important historical reason, which we knew this. Another is that, like Dungeons, many games can be played both alone and with friends, and keeping player count close makes for a more consistent experience. And See, again, so this is the one, this reason here, a more consistent experience. I get it. And it's difficult as a developer to come up and a game designer to balance games. I just feel like we have data and we have tools available to make this a lot easier. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole game itself has to be built for 5, 6 players or 8 players. And we're not talking the difference between 4 and 12 players here. We're talking a couple extra players. But just giving the game the ability to have a mode or certain maps that can have a larger player count just might be more welcoming to a larger player base. That said, I suspect there's also more of a human factor at play. When collaborating with others, we can only take in so much information at once. It may be that a player count of about 4 just happens to maximize the fun. By reaching a good mix of complex, interesting coordination and avoiding information overload. I think there's an analogy in team sports where many popular sports have relatively few players on at one time. Okay. All right. Most popular sports in the world. Football, soccer, I think there's 10 players. Cricket has to be 5 or 6 players. Hockey's 5 plus the goalie per side, so 6 players. Tennis is 1 to 2. Volleyball is 2 to 6. Table tennis 1 to 2. Basketball is 5. Baseball's like 10. Rugby 7. And then golf is 1 player. I don't think that the popular sports have relatively few players on at any one time, so don't know where this analogy came from. I think that the same reason can be extended to online games. I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the most popular online MOBAs and shooters pitch teams of 5 against one another. Finally, it's a question of practicality. Getting a few friends together to play a game is much easier than trying to find the 10 you need for a football team. So wait a second, they also just contradict themselves here. Popular sports need 10, but they said there's only 1 at a time, so I'm not on board with that. For MOBAs and shooters, a pitch of 5 against each other, so I agree with that. The trying to find 10 competitive players on, that's why I think it's a lot of 5, right? Like even MOBA or like Valorant or games like that. But a lot of them also have those extra modes where you can play with more than 5 players. And that's all we're asking here. We're not saying the only game mode has to be for 5. It's just making the game accessible to more players. All right, Adam Brennick, the game director for Grounded. What factors led you to land on designing your game around 4 players? Even from our initial pitch, Grounded was conceptualized as a co-op multiplayer survival game with character and story. Okay, I said right at the very beginning, if it's a story-driven game, it's okay to have less players if it doesn't add to the experience. We just don't want to get lazy and cap at 4 because we didn't want to add more experience. How did we land on 4 players? 2 didn't seem like enough for a party, and more than 4 seemed like too many for each character to have distinct personality. This says, I didn't want to spend the effort developing more distinct personalities. But AI wasn't around then, so maybe we'll cut them a break. At the end of the day, 4 just felt right when thinking about working together as a team. Some of our favorite teams from our wild 80s childhood were 4, like Ghostbusters, Ninja Turtles, and we wanted to capture this feeling of 4 distinct personalities to choose from when playing Grounded. On top of that, from a development perspective, 4 players is manageable both on technology and design side of the game. Combat and loot, for example, can be balanced around a team of 4 and gets much more complicated the more players are added into the mix. So it does get a little bit more complicated, but when they keep saying more players, I think they keep going into like the MMO style. Like we're not talking about 12 players the game. We're talking about 5 or 6. But if there is inspiration from like arcade machines like Ninja Turtles, then I think that makes sense why they went this way. When did this decision take place during development, and what was the conversation like? It was a very early decision. I believe it was made during the pitch process and we haven't thought too much about it, which means it was a good fit. Well, they won't think about too much till now. Why do you think 4 players is a common design choice among cooperative games? One thing that comes to mind is what we've been accustomed to is 4 players as gamers. My favorite multiplayer game, even going back to arcades, have supported 4 players. I'm assuming some of these decisions were made due to the size of screen compared to the size of characters, memory limitations, and physical controller space on the arcade cabinet. Later, home couch co-op normalized 4 players due to the fact that consoles have supported 4 controllers for years as a standard, and split screen works great with 4. One thing that really stands out is the memory limitations here and, physical controller space on the arcade cabinets. The technology that people were working with back in the 80s to create 4-player game experiences was so limited. Nowadays, we have the tools and technologies to easily make these games, and it's just really a matter about putting in the effort of balancing and creating the immersive experience that we want so that we don't have our friends sitting in Discord alone crying, saying that they just want to play with us. Yeah, so I stand by this. This definitely sheds some light onto why these games are being developed for 4 players. I don't accept it, and when Fire and Brimco comes out, I'll make sure there is at least one game mode. Even though the entire game is developed as a single-player story game, there will be a game mode where you and at least, 6 friends can play together.